It's a really, really good question. I think if you look at it historically, without making this part too long, what most people now refer to as behavioral science is what they mean by behavioral economics. So it's a deviation from neoclassical economics, so economics as people know it, into a science or a form of economics that incorporates a lot of behavioral science, meaning psychology in this case. So that is one way to approach this field, where it flows out of economics and just has a whole bunch of different assumptions. And this is now how we model behavior. This is how we design experiments. And this is how we assume that people behave. These are the core assumptions that we make. That is behavioral economics. Now, behavioral science in this regard is much more of an umbrella term, which essentially captures all the sciences that study human behavior. So you would see economics as a behavioral science. Psychology would also be a behavioral science, but so would be marketing, management, and a lot of the humanities, which most people wouldn't associate with behavioral sciences, such as anthropology and sociology. They would fall under that umbrella as well. Well, we've come from, I mean, how far do you want to go back historically? I think initially, so everything comes from philosophy, right? That's where every kind of science, every field of study comes from. And then economics has had a very long journey towards wanting to be recognized as a science. They don't want to be recognized as, a soft science. They want to be a hard science, which led them to in the 1920s cut out everything that had to do with psychology, human emotion, and they want to be a formalized science or hard science in terms of modeling, mathematics, etc. Now, from the 50s and 60s onwards, a lot of academics were not incredibly keen on this development, both from the economic side as well as from the psychology side. The psychologists wanted back in, and the economists had serious concerns about what was going on, some of them at least. So throughout that development, throughout the 70s and 80s, we obviously saw amazing work being done by Vernon Smith in experimental economics, and of course Kahneman and Tversky, amongst many others, in the 70s and 80s, laying the groundwork of, say, prospect theory, for example. This has slowly started to build and become a recognized academic discipline of its own. And then when it had kind of solidified its academic groundings, there actually were a lot of applications for the field as well. And this is what we've now mainly seen through the early 2000s, which is now blossoming throughout, where we see applied behavioral science. So do I think the field is fully mainstream? No, but we are working on it. I think a lot of people may still struggle to understand what behavioral science is, especially with the recent developments in technology that we've had. I feel like a lot of people may also argue that realistically, a behaviorally informed designer is more useful to have than a behavioral scientist. So with some companies, you don't see behavioral science teams yet, if ever, but they have people who are behaviorally informed, who are implementing behavioral insights, but they're not necessarily behavioral scientists. So we're currently at a very interesting point where we're kind of going back and forth, as in, are these companies going to pick up behavioral units? Are they going to have behavioral scientists? Or realistically, do they want their people to be behaviorally informed? And will behavioral sciences be one of the many tools that their designers or their strategists or their UXers implement? That's a very good question. I don't think so. Let me clarify that I am academically trained. I have a PhD in it, as you mentioned, but I don't think that only good behavioral science comes out of academia. I am under no illusions that the only way to get good behavioral insight is through reading academic papers. Academia, in that regard, has built a massive ivory gate around itself to make sure it could stay in its own ivory tower, and that comes with ramifications, meaning that some people simply cannot access all the good stuff and all the great research that you're publishing, meaning that it doesn't really trickle down the mainstream. Academia is responsible for that itself. Now, there's lots of amazing applied behavioral scientists, so practitioners, if you will, that publish white papers that are widely accessible, that are able to share their resources. So assuming that, practitioners read other practitioners' work to make sure that applied science can continue to move forward, that is where I assume a lot of people get their information. Now, when I say an applied behavioral scientist, I do assume someone who does the field proud, to say it really colloquially, meaning that someone, who has the best intentions, who does keep up with what behavioral science is out there, who may occasionally read an academic paper, or at least is on board and tuned into how behavioral science is developing both in the applied world as well as the theoretical world. But there are people who get this wrong. Not all behavioral science out there is good behavioral science, regardless of whether it's applied or academic. So there's, we always have to keep a critical mind about ourselves when we read behavioral science, or when we read anything, really. I find it really interesting when you approach stakeholders, or when you approach anyone really, and they ask you this question, like, don't you find the work that you do very manipulative? Aren't you afraid that you're gonna move people in a certain direction? This might not be a direction that they want to go. And I think this is a fundamental understanding of how, I guess, our environment works. There is no such thing as a neutral state of an environment, as in there is no value neutral design. Any kind of design makes it more likely for one thing than the other to happen. A behavioral scientist, at least most people who come from a pro-human or a human-centered behavioral science approach, look at this environment and they say, well, the way that it's currently designed or divided, if you will, humans are most likely to do X. However, in the longer term, or maybe even already in the shorter term, we know people actually prefer to do Y. So let's redesign the environment to move decisions away from X and move them towards Y. That is how nudges work. That is how behavioral design works. So there's a lot of people, and we especially see this debate when we're looking at defaults, where we change defaults. So like we make sure people are automatically enrolled in one thing rather than not being enrolled at all. And people find that very, very manipulative, or at least some have come out arguing that this is very, very manipulative, because people are now enrolled in something they may not want to be enrolled in. But no one ever really considers the prior state where people weren't enrolled in something that could be incredibly beneficial to them. So in the United States, for example, the 401k programs very often don't have any form of automatic enrollment. So people don't contribute to their pension fund at all, which we all know, excuse me, which we all know is something that we should be aiming for. Because if you're completely and utterly unprepared for your retirement, that's going to be a massive problem. So I find this debate, like, is it manipulative? Is it bad? Do people actually want this? I find it a relatively useless debate if you don't consider the prior state where design was suboptimal to begin with, and now we are trying to improve it. I guess from a behavioral science perspective, it kind of depends on what you do. Like, a lot of marketing is behaviorally informed, and behavioral science can learn a lot from marketing. That's absolutely true. I would love to see someone argue against that, especially as marketeers have got quite a few decades of experience on us. But I feel like it might depend on the purpose. So obviously there's behavioral scientists who sludge. So they don't nudge, they don't try to make people better off, but they sludge, they try to make someone who's not the people better off, potentially company or themselves. That can go either way. And a lot of marketing, if it's not pro-public good or pro-environment, for example, can be considered a lot of sludging. For example, I mean, I am a younger woman, and a lot of marketing campaigns targeted towards me. For example, I love my makeup, but a lot of makeup campaigns, especially in the early 2000s, were essentially exclusively targeting every single thing you were insecure about, and their product would fix you. Now, obviously, it's very behaviorally informed. It plays into your insecurities, your emotions. It will motivate you to buy, but for all the wrong reasons. So is it behaviorally informed? Yes. Is it good behavioral science? No. So, these types of things, like you can go, and any science, any application, you can do well, and you can do it for good, but you can also do it incredibly crappily, and you can do it for bad. But that's not inherent to behavioral science. That's inherent to life. Anyone can benefit from behavioral science. Like, for example, a lot of people who, for example, are excellent managers may suck at managing their personal lives. I find most people aren't good all around. Most people aren't like a master of all trades. That's just not how the saying goes. So there's always something that behavioral science can do for you, whether that is nudging yourself to eat healthier, or to take better care of your mental health, or to be more strategic in your decision making, even if we take this out of a corporate context into your personal life. You can use behavioral science to approach people from a more empathetic or understanding viewpoint, maybe in your personal life, maybe if you're a people manager, for example. There's always applications for it. So is someone already getting this right? Well, just because you get one aspect right doesn't mean you get the rest of it right either, right? So behavioral science will always be incredibly applicable, and I can refer you to many people who explain how you can use behavioral science in your day-to-day life, which I absolutely love to do. Now, the question, are certain people more resistant to behavioral interventions? Yes, but that's not necessarily a positive thing. So there's a lot of literature in the behavioral sciences which looks at overconfidence. Now, confidence in and of itself is not a bad thing. Overconfidence is a type of confidence where your belief in your abilities far exceeds your actual abilities, which is problematic to say the least. And we see that if you are very overconfident in your own abilities, that you become less and less inclined to take any form of guidance, whether that is advice, whether that is a nudge, whether it is any kind of intervention, whether it's behaviorally informed or not. Overconfidence, at least specifically within the financial domain, of course, which is where I'm currently active in, is specifically associated with younger men. Now, younger men are also again linked to making much more riskier and short-term focused decisions. So we now have a group of people who feel very overconfident, who as a result don't really take well to nudges or guidance, but also make types of decisions which are very focused in the here and now, which could potentially be very risky, meaning that in the longer term, a lot of this stuff may not pan out. And that is not the ideal combination of traits to have in a demographic. So this group has proven particularly resistant to a lot of interventions, specifically in the financial domain, specifically in that domain. During my PhD, I was actually really disappointed with how little writing there was, or like dissemination of information to people who could actively use it. I am a massive proponent of using behavioral insights, whether academic or applied to your own life, especially because a lot of people struggle with just managing money. Now, I have to make it very clear, because I work in the financial sector, I do not give personal financial advice, but I can explain to you how an academic paper, how a couple of insights from that paper may be applicable to your own life, and things that you could consider if you are interested in doing that. And that is essentially what I've been doing for the past 5, almost 6-ish years. I've just been writing about how this tends to work, what behavioral insights you can apply to yourself, how behavioral science is evolving. And that's essentially what that blog is for. It's just making sure that people can actually get to these insights, because otherwise they're just hidden behind academic paywalls and they don't do anyone any good. Oh, fair enough. So this is from ages ago. So I had a friend back in the master's degree, which we both did at Warwick University. Her name is Etiosa. And she knew for a fact that she wanted to do the master's and she wanted to get back into corporate, which she did. And I was by this stage hell-bent on doing a PhD. So by this stage, we had these conversations, and I went on to the PhD and she went on to corporate. But we very quickly realized that, we're both now rookies in our field. We had very little connections. And of course, really career progression is more about who you know than what you know, especially as ChatGPT can tell you what you ought to know, but they can't tell you who you should know and how well you should know them. So we essentially started the interview series to, first of all, get a better idea of the field that we've just gotten ourselves into, because we were 1 master's in. Like 1 year of educational training does not, make that you understand and have a good feeling for a field. And we wanted to get to know more people. And, you know, having people talk about themselves, as you are well aware, is an excellent excuse to get to know people better. And they're very happy to take you up on that. So that's what we did. I initially interviewed 6 academics. I think my very first interview was with Dilip Soman, which I thoroughly enjoyed because I'm a massive fan of Dilip. And then she interviewed 6 practitioners, and all these people were from all over the world. And then she did that, and she was happy with it. Her job at the time was very hardcore, very time consuming. My PhD was obviously more flexible in nature, so I could assign hours how I saw fit, and I really enjoyed it, so I kept doing it. So those 6 interviews turned into many, many more interviews, and I'll hit 200 interviews this year. So I guess also part of the Money on the Mind blog is that I wrote about my PhD experience, because I got onto my PhD with a lot of misconceptions and with a lot of gaps in my knowledge, and I don't really want that for anyone else. So this is not behavioral science specific, but I'm very vocal about, I think, every aspect of my life. I've been very vocal about developments in behavioral science. I've been very vocal about academia. And the excuse the language, clusterfuck that it sometimes is, because it's really opaque, which I thought was very surprising. And there's a lot of practices going on in academia that I'm personally really not a fan of. I find them archaic, and that's a very positive term of describing it. And in the current state of academia, essentially, you're looking at a pyramid scheme, because for a lot of young researchers, there is absolutely no way to get to this top. And as a result, a lot of people actually leave academia, which is what I have done myself. And I don't think there is currently a book or a written resource, like a step-by-step guide almost, on explaining to you, well, if you don't want to be an academic, yet you've got several more years to go on a PhD, well, what should you be doing? Because the academic trajectory is to become an academic, whereas now I think in the UK alone, at least half of PhDs will never go into academia. They leave and they don't come back. So it's just you know, a massive missed opportunity, but also just a massive gap of knowledge in the market that a lot of young research do need. So I was very happy to write the book. I'm very happy to have it published. So I'm very proud of that. But from a behavioral science perspective, I'm just really happy to have finished the PhD. I'm proud to have done it. Wasn't under the best circumstances, which is why I wrote the book. And I'm super happy to have left academia, to have moved into corporate, and now see what it really means to get your hands dirty and make people's lives better using behavioral science. And that can be incredibly complicated, because not every business is equally open to having behavioral science applied. And the realities of applying behavioral science, they are difficult and they are very messy. And I'm already just proud to be able to start figuring this out. And I have an excellent team to do it with, so. The thing is, this idea that I'm literally going to spell out now is not something I came up with, and we have been seeing this for years. So this gap is being closed. So for example, if you look at several firms in the financial services, they but also in government. So for example, in BIT, so which is originally British, of course now a global behavioral science initiative. If you look at BETA, which is from the Australian government, these are all units that have very strong academic ties. And it's very uncommon these days to see behavioral science firms that do not have academic setups or academic ties whatsoever. And this is for a variety of reasons. Now, obviously, if you run these types of interventions on customers, it helps to have an academic there, or it helps to have anyone there who has decades and decades of experience and knows this theory very well. This still tends to be predominantly academic, but obviously the practitioners can more than keep up these days. But what may also help is that in addition to just running this in the public domain, or for a company or for a government, is that the academic collaborators then take this and also publish this academically. Whereas from the company's perspective or the government's perspective, this can also be published in a white paper. So essentially you work together to make sure that you can hit both of these trajectories. Now the academics can read the academic paper and see the theory behind applied behavioral science, And then through the applied route, a lot of people will, well, way more people will have access to the paper, essentially. Maybe even some academics will read it. I'm sure they're not completely opposed, but the paper is much more widely accessible. It is written in a language which is much more accessible, and you can understand both, you know, what the company is doing, what the academic is doing, what the results are, and really what you need to, you know, really keep in mind if you were to try to replicate this yourself as an individual or as a firm. So I think these collaborative efforts are something that we should really cheer on. But of course, they do come with their own drawbacks, where not everything you design to support people is academically interesting, and not everything an academic wants to design is something a company has any remote interest in. So there are still tensions there, but I think we are slowly but surely working those out. And I think these collaborations between academia and the applied world are something we should, you know, we should be really supportive of. And I always love to see them. Am I excited about technological developments? Yes, but I am a massive nerd, so that's really not surprising that I'm excited. But I think what a lot of people, and this is incredibly understandable if you're in this field and you've been in this field for so long and you're also a massive nerd, we find this exciting. But I think if you ask the average person, like, hey, are you keen on like an AI like recommending you financial products? Or are you keen on AI telling you what you should do in terms of the groceries you buy, the food you consume, how much you should be working out, or maybe like really sensitive health choices? Because what a lot of people don't realize is that, yes, the technology exists, but for an AI, for example, to really make accurate recommendations, which in a lot of countries also isn't legal depending on the domain, which is something a lot of people seem to forget. But you need to put a lot of data in. Now, I know a lot of, and honestly, no one is under the guise that Facebook and Amazon don't already know everything about you. I'm sure they do. But for health recommendations, or for an AI to operate in health or behavioral health even, it needs to know a lot of information about you. And health information is one of the most sensitive kind of informations that we have. And a lot of people may be absolutely uncomfortable to share that. And you can't force people to share that, because that's just not how that works. Especially not if you're a country that's part of the GDPR laws. So do I think this technology is great? Yes, but I think a lot of people have not considered the kind of input that would really optimize this technology, and how averse a lot of people still are to this, which, if you are averse to this level of data sharing, that's very much a personal preference, and I don't have a value opinion on that. I don't think that's either bad or great that you're so concerned about certain types of data. And we've seen this in the behavioral science literature as well, or in the psychology literature, or in the innovation literature, time and time again, that people really aren't comfortable sharing that much data. They know it's out there in Facebook, but or insert any other social media platform here, but that's a very different kind of data than knowing all of someone's financials or all of someone's medical background. That's not something I think a lot of people are comfortable putting into an AI, or have a company put into an AI. And I'm curious to see how that tension is going to develop, because the average consumer is still relatively AI averse. Yeah, having a chat with ChatGPT, that's cute. Having an AI advisor tell you what you ought to be doing with your life, especially if you can't get to a human advisor as an extension of this AI, I think that will take a much longer than a lot of people think before that breaks through into the mainstream for the consumer. From a corporate perspective, this looks very different, but from a consumer's perspective, I don't think it's going to go as fast as a lot of people think. It's an incredibly interesting question from an applied perspective. I mean, can people build? So obviously, if you have entire choice sets, like you can see in financial data, in health data, in purchasing data, like how people make trade-offs and how they may give into their system one biases, or their temptations, if you will. And you can see that, in certain choice sets, people pick option one, which is clearly not financially or health or whatever optimal. And you can essentially, from that choice, derive which bias they might have been prone to in that moment. Now, if you train an AI on that choice set to always take these certain choices under certain conditions, you can build an AI which is essentially a replica of System 1, or at least an averaged out version of System 1 across a large population of certain characteristics. That's absolutely possible. But then I guess my question is, why? So then you have a System 1 AI, okay, System 2 AI, much easier because you just need to find the optimal. And if you can build into an AI what the optimal is, especially in financial choice sets. Out of context, the optimal is very easy to derive at, with either the thing with the best cost-benefit trade-offs, or is just the cheapest one. Financially very easy to calculate. The AI will have us beat the majority of the time. I have no concerns there. So let's say that we now have a System 1 AI and we have a System 2 AI. We've been able to build those. I'm sure, Nobel Peace Prize for whomever managed. But then what? I struggle to sometimes see what the application is of this thing. So are we now merging them to see what people are most likely to choose? Or are we building this AI to see that if we present people with a certain choice architecture, what they are most likely to choose before we even expose customers to it, to make sure that we can determine the pitfalls? Is this a diagnostics tool? I'd love to see it, but I haven't actually heard anyone speak about this AI as if it is supposed to be a diagnostics tool. And I'm sure, for example, if you look at a lot of health choices, that this would be a very interesting application of AI. But I don't know if that's what people are currently doing. Like you can, and this is the thing, right? If you've built these AIs and you've built a System 1 and System 2, you've merged them, or maybe you haven't, however you wish to go about it. Are we using this for people to see where the pitfalls are, as I said before? Or are we using this against people? Is this going to be a nudge, or is this going to be a sludge creator? I don't know. I think there's incredibly interesting opportunities to happen. But I think another thing that people should really tune into is that it seems that we are assuming that AI can do most things without knowing any kind of context. And this is where people thrive. People's choices can be incredibly unstable if you look at it at first glance, where are these people's preference sets? Where are their assumptions? Where are the foundations and the priors that they're reasoning from? But if the context is different, even if it's just a small tweak, that the human mind, as amazing as it is, knows that it's not looking at the same thing. And things have to change. Some of that stuff is irrelevant. That's where the biases and the heuristics, that's where the papers from the 80s and 90s had a field day. They're proving out, oh, in this context, people get it wrong. Oh, in this context, people get it wrong. Okay, what about the 97 contexts in which I got it right, though? It's a highly rhetorical question. I mean, obviously, I've got such a vested interest in the answer as well. But no, I think behavioral science will always be advantageous to you. But I think especially if you lead the company, if you're a CEO or the founder of it, or if you lead an entire department, approach behavioral science with a very clear strategy in mind. Otherwise, you're going to get lost in it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I personally love being lost in behavioral science. But if you have a very clear aim that you want to get from behavioral science, as in you are in HR or you are in risk, where you have a very clear aim for what you need to get from behavioral science. And that's a great starting point. But save yourself the heartache and the endless nights and the reading of books that may or may not help you out. Not every pop science book in behavioral science is an excellent read, nor really where you should be starting. So reach out to whomever you have relatively close to you. And of course, in this Zoom or a post-pandemic world, everyone is technically speaking close. They're only ever a button and a coffee away. And see if you can meet with some people who can give you guidance, whether they're academics or practitioners, it doesn't really matter. So if you're looking at risk, well, who is good at understanding risk? In which circumstances? Are there other companies who are already doing that? Are you looking at risk in health, risk in finance, risk, like internal or external facing risk? There are already so many excellent behavioral science firms, whether they are internal or external to companies, or internal or external facing rather, that can just help you on your way if this is the journey that you want to start. these days, I don't think I recommend just going online and Googling a whole thing and then reading 20 articles, whether they're white papers or academic papers, and then saying, okay, I now have an idea of what's going on here. Because quite frankly, it is a very tricky way of getting into behavioral science. And I would always recommend that someone has, in every aspect of their life, like almost a mentor, so that you find yourself a mentor to get into behavioral science with, especially if you are responsible for leading a department or an entire firm. I think it's just a more responsible way to go into the field with, as you know, especially with someone who has decades of experience with that field, and who can, and you know, especially if it's someone who has done the journey that you're about to embark on themselves, because they know exactly which pitfalls you might fall into, and they can also give you tips on how to sell this to your stakeholders, because not everyone by default is very pro behavioral science. I just hope for anyone who listens to this that they're keen on getting into behavioral science themselves, but please do so responsibly. That's all.